one of the things that I think is really interesting, and Ken mentioned it about a little bit about his background, is we're seeing more and more campaign folks move over to public affairs entities and work with groups. And so with that, we're seeing a shift with some, specific campaign tactics that worked on the campaign trail, and now we're working with the public affairs, like door knocking and phone calls and email. What's some of the best tactics that you guys have seen borrowed from the campaign work that are now working in the issue advocacy space?
Nicole, I think you had a really good example when we were first talking about it. I'll let you go first and then pile on.
Oh. Well, I used my I've got a lot of examples, but that was one that was particularly recent with that telephone town hall. So let me give another example. Particularly with state lawmakers, they have one staff person, or maybe they have no staff at all, but they're not insulated in the same way that a senator might be. And so it's pretty easy to reach them in their neighborhood. And so we had a client, who I love because they're just so scrappy. We dropped a pin on where the lawmaker lived and pulled a list of voters, I think like 250 or so around their home. And we texted them and said, hey, your lawmaker, Joe Smith, is a critical vote on XYZ. If you see him around in the neighborhood, make sure to tell him to vote yes. So we texted that to people with cell phones. We robocalled people who had landlines. And then this was the best part to me. They then sent, I think, 2 or 3 people who worked on their team into the neighborhood to door knock. And so they knocked maybe 50 doors, but they knocked in the neighborhood right after the text and the automated call came out. So people were aware of the issue. Then they had a great time taking their literature and taking some selfies. They posted it on social media and they tagged the lawmaker. So then, after the text, after seeing people in the neighborhood, you can't walk your dog without hearing about this issue. Then they see that picture on social media, and that got a lot of attention, frankly for a low cost, because the amount of outreach was small compared to the impact that it had.
Yeah, that's great. And I think, something to add to that is kind of a newer tactic that we've seen is just using peer-to-peer texting in the advocacy space. Targeted Victory, most people know us for our robust political operation, but, I sit on the corporate side, so it's really exciting when we get to use some of the techniques that we're using for our political candidates in the corporate space. And peer-to-peer has just been kind of, a really impressive tool that we've unlocked. Being able to have those kind of one-to-one conversations at scale is something that we've seen just really benefit our clients. Being able to kind of personalize the issue, recruit and engage those advocates, and give them kind of a direct way to respond is something that's been great. Not having to, solely rely on, social media and those digital platforms that are constantly, changing algorithms. Having that kind of direct line of communication through peer-to-peer has been great. And of course, we're seeing, super high open rates compared to, again, what you're measuring in the digital space. And then kind of going back to those other tactics that you mentioned, Ken, I think, combining all of those tools together is really where we see the most reinforcement and our, for our strategy and our messaging. So in a perfect world, you'd be able to have budget to do a little bit of all of this. So you have, that full kind of integrated, surround sound approach. And I think one of the kind of important things to think about too, when you have all these different facets of a campaign operating, is making sure that things aren't operating in a silo, making sure that you're all coordinating on more specifically the type of audience that you're targeting. So where you can, sharing that first and third party data, so that way, again, you're talking to the same audience through those various touch points and increasing the frequency.
And the only thing I would add, and this also kind of goes back to the previous question about letters to the editor and op-eds, is like, to the extent and different listservs and different neighborhood forums have different rules, so you have to be a little bit cognizant of that. But if you have advocates in an area, especially if you have a hyper local issue and they're willing to respectfully put that issue forward somehow, and whether it's next door or the neighborhood, parent listserv or something. I mean, all politics is definitely local, and that's really, really an effective tool of like, oh, well, I know that person, like even probably more so than seeing it in a physical newspaper, which most folks are not necessarily opening up these days. Really taking advantage of, I think when people think social, they think, X and Facebook and TikTok, but, I would include in that category things like Nextdoor and Google Groups and stuff like that, where a lot of folks get a lot of their information and are probably checking in at least daily.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that. Well, go ahead, Brittany.
I was just gonna echo everything Ken said. I think that's great.
Yeah, and I also think some of those kind of like they don't have some of the negativity and bias that I think that sometimes people see things on Facebook or X, and sometimes we take our political news with a grain of salt, but if you see it on Nextdoor and it's posted by a person that lives in your neighborhood, I think there's a level of trust to that some of the other platforms people doubt.